Good morning. Here's a word I heard a long time ago called the numinous. The numinous. So I was reading C.S. Lewis, and he speaks about it, and it's a kind of thing we're probably sort of aware of. Um, there's a book called Eternity in the Hearts, Don Richardson, and he kind of shows how that in the hearts of many tribal peoples all over the world, they have this sense of a supreme being. Well, the numinous is that kind of idea. It comes from a person called Professor Otto. I don't know who he is, unfortunately, but the idea is there's a sense everywhere. Not all the time, but we have a sense that there is a presence of um, the Almighty. But even that we wouldn't. Just this presence that gives a sense of awe and even a sense of dread. He calls that the numinous, and that it is all pervading, that it is everywhere. And it's not a fear like a fear that you would have of if you knew there was a serpent in the room next to you or a tiger roaming. But it is a kind of a more something uncanny that I can't put my finger on it at all. I can't define it, but I know and I sense it. Well, this is the numinous, and everybody kind of has a feel and a sense of it, throughout all places. So the second thing he talks about and is that there is a thing in everybody called ought. I ought to do this. I ought not to do that. And where does that come from? This sense of I ought not to do this and I ought to do that. So he says the numinous, which is an awe, this kind of sense of awe that we occasionally feel, not at the universe itself, but at some presence within and above the universe. And he says there's an awe there, but then there's an ought, and everybody has this ought. I ought to do this, and I ought to do that. So these two kind of prevailing things just are there. They are in the world. We are conscious of them throughout. So he gives the one other step in it, and he says that people have figured that the numinous or the awe and the ought are linked, that this presence, this awe that somewhere that pervades everything, that we sense it, and this sense of ought, I ought to do this and I ought not to do that, that they're linked. And it kind of has people groping for God and grappling to kind of appease this presence. And then the last thing he says, this is all from C.S. Lewis, is that one people defined the numinous, and then they defined the ought, and they defined the connection of it, and that was the Jewish people. They put a name on the numinous, a clear name, and they described the numinous. And the ought, they put very clear lines of what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. And they clearly says, yes, the sense of awe that gives us this, you ought to do this and you ought not to do that, it comes from Yahweh, from God, the God of Israel. And they describe him. And then, as we said, not only do they link the two of them together, that this numinous, but they clearly define who the numinous is, and they describe his attributes in many ways. And then they also define what actually you ought to do and what actually you ought not to do. And so there you go. It's just a few thoughts for the day from C.S. Lewis. Okay, have a good day. Bye-bye.